Hello everyone and welcome back to Sleep Theories. I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world and whatever time you're listening to this. Whether it's the middle of the night or you're winding down after a long day, thank you for being here. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, please subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content like this. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. The document was never supposed to see the light of day. Stamped with security classifications that would have sent most people to federal prison just for reading it, the memo dated September 15th, 1987, contained only 3 lines of text that would haunt the intelligence community for decades to come. Subject: Dr. Nathaniel Voss. Status update. As of 0347 hours, Dr. Voss has ceased all known existence following temporal field test designation TX-77. No remains recovered. Project Kronos to continue under new leadership. Ceased all known existence. Not killed, not deceased. Ceased all known existence. The memo, leaked by a dying CIA operative in 2003, would spark one of the most persistent conspiracy theories of the modern era. Because according to those who worked alongside him, Dr. Nathaniel Voss wasn't just a physicist who died in a laboratory accident. He was a man who stumbled upon the most dangerous secret the government had ever tried to bury, a secret that challenged the very nature of time itself. This is the story of Project Kronos, the underground program that claimed to master time travel, and the brilliant scientist who knew too much about what they were really doing with that power. It's a story that begins in the late 1970s with a phone call that would change everything, and ends with a man who may still be out there, somewhere in time, trying to undo the damage that was done. Dr. Nathaniel Voss had always been fascinated by the impossible. As a child in suburban Oregon, he would spend hours staring at his grandmother's antique clock, mesmerized by the steady tick of seconds that seemed to march forward with such absolute certainty. Time, he thought, was the one thing in the universe that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be negotiated with, couldn't be changed. He was wrong about that last part. By 1978, Voss had established himself as one of MIT's most promising young physicists. His doctoral thesis on quantum field theory had earned him recognition in academic circles, and his subsequent work on particle acceleration had caught the attention of several government contractors. At 32, he was already being consulted on projects that pushed the boundaries of known science. So when the call came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, Voss wasn't entirely surprised to hear from another government liaison. What surprised him was the nature of the offer. Dr. Voss, my name is Colonel Marcus Thornfield. The voice on the phone was crisp and military in its precision. I represent a Department of Defense research initiative that could use your expertise. Voss had heard similar pitches before. Defense contractors were always looking for physicists to work on radar systems, missile guidance, or satellite technology. The pay was excellent, the work was classified, and the moral implications were something you learned not to think about too deeply. What kind of research? Voss asked, settling into his desk chair. Particle acceleration, Thornfield replied. Specifically, applications for satellite defense systems. I'm not at liberty to discuss details over the phone, but I can tell you that this project represents the cutting edge of theoretical physics. We're talking about possibilities that most of your colleagues would consider science fiction. There was something in Thornfield's tone that suggested he wasn't talking about conventional weapons research. Voss found himself intrigued despite his better judgment. Where would this work take place? Nevada. A specialized facility designed specifically for high-energy physics research. Dr. Voss, I'll be direct with you. This isn't a typical government contract. What we're working on could revolutionize our understanding of space and time itself, but it requires discretion, complete discretion. 2 weeks later, Voss found himself on a military transport plane flying into the Nevada desert. He had signed more non-disclosure agreements than he could count, submitted to background checks that delved into every aspect of his life, and agreed to spend the next 2 years at a facility whose location wouldn't appear on any map. The compound, officially designated Research Station 7, looked unremarkable from the surface. A collection of low, concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing and guard towers. It could have been any government installation in the middle of nowhere, But as Voss would soon discover, the real work happened far below ground. The elevator descended for what felt like minutes before finally stopping at sub-level 3. When the doors opened, Voss stepped into a world that belonged more in a science fiction novel than reality. The corridor stretched out before him, lined with reinforced steel walls and lit by harsh fluorescent lights. The air hummed with electrical energy, and he could feel the subtle vibration of massive machinery operating somewhere deeper in the complex. "Welcome to Project Kronos," Colonel Thornfield said, leading Voss down the corridor. "Officially, we're researching advanced particle acceleration techniques for satellite-based defense systems. Unofficially, Dr. Voss, we're exploring the possibility of temporal displacement." Voss stopped walking. Temporal displacement? Thornfield turned to face him, his expression deadly serious. "Time travel, Dr. Voss. We're trying to crack the code on time travel." The laboratory that Thornfield showed him defied description. The main chamber was the size of an aircraft hangar, dominated by a cylindrical structure that rose 3 stories high and hummed with barely contained energy. Magnetic field generators surrounded the chamber, their coils gleaming like metallic serpents. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens flickering with data that would have taken Voss years to fully understand. "The power source?" Voss asked, his physicist's mind automatically cataloguing the energy requirements for such an installation. "Repurposed nuclear reactor," Thornfield replied casually. "We cannibalized a submarine reactor and modified it for our needs. The entire facility draws about 40 megawatts at peak operation." Voss whistled low. 40 megawatts could power a small city. Whatever they were doing here required enormous amounts of energy. "The theoretical framework?" he asked. Thornfield handed him a thick binder marked with security classifications. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann developed the initial theories. German physicist, recruited after the war. His work suggested that extreme gravitational fields combined with precisely calibrated electromagnetic radiation could create distortions in space-time. Voss flipped through the binder, his eyes widening as he absorbed the theoretical implications. Zimmermann's work was brilliant, decades ahead of anything being published in academic journals. But the math was incomplete, the applications purely theoretical. "How long have you been working on this?" Voss asked. "The project officially began in 1962, Thornfield replied. "We've had some interesting results." That night, alone in his assigned quarters, Voss stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Time travel was the stuff of fantasy, the domain of science fiction writers and amateur theorists. Real physicists understood the paradoxes, the impossibilities, the fundamental violations of causality that would result from any attempt to travel backward through time. But the mathematics in Zimmermann's notes were undeniably elegant, and the facility he had seen suggested that the government was investing serious resources in making the impossible possible. The next morning, Voss met his new colleagues, Dr. Lillian Blackwood, a brilliant quantum physicist from Stanford, Dr. Victor Castellanos, a specialist in electromagnetic field manipulation, Dr. Raina Ashworth, whose work on gravitational theory had earned her a place among the world's leading theoretical physicists. Together they comprised the core research team for Project Kronos. "The official story is particle acceleration research," Dr. Blackwood explained as they toured the facility. "But what we're really doing is trying to create controlled tiers in the fabric of space-time." "With what end goal?" Voss asked. Dr. Ashworth looked around carefully before answering. "Initially, scientific exploration. The ability to observe historical events firsthand would revolutionize archaeology, anthropology, history itself. Initially, the military applications became apparent pretty quickly," Dr. Castellanos said grimly. "Imagine being able to send intelligence operatives to any point in history. Imagine being able to prevent disasters, eliminate threats before they emerge, ensure that key historical events unfold in America's favour." Voss felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If time travel were possible, it wouldn't remain a tool of scientific exploration for long. In the wrong hands, it could become the ultimate weapon. The first successful experiment occurred on a Tuesday morning in March 1979. Voss had been at the facility for 5 months, long enough to understand the theoretical framework, but still amazed by the sheer audacity of what they were attempting. The test chamber was a cylindrical space roughly 10 feet in diameter, surrounded by magnetic field generators that could produce forces measured in the hundreds of Teslas. When fully activated, the chamber became a localized distortion in space-time, a bubble where the normal rules of physics bent to the will of human engineering. "We're starting with a simple temporal displacement," Dr. Blackwood announced to the observation team. "Target duration, 30 seconds backward." The test subject was a mechanical clock placed in the centre of the chamber and synchronized with atomic clocks in the observation room. The theory was straightforward. If they could create a localized temporal field, the clock inside the chamber would experience time differently than the clocks outside. "Initiating magnetic field generation," Dr. Ashworth called out from her station. The chamber began to hum, a low vibration that Voss could feel in his bones. The air inside the chamber began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. "Field strength at 70%, Dr. Castellanos reported. "Gravitational distortion detected," Dr. Blackwood added, monitoring her instruments with intense concentration. "Field strength at 90%. The shimmer inside the chamber intensified, becoming almost liquid in appearance. The mechanical clock appeared to waver, as if viewed through water. "Field strength at 100%. Initiating temporal displacement sequence." There was a flash of light so bright that Voss had to shield his eyes. When his vision cleared, the chamber appeared normal again, but the clock inside had stopped. "Temporal field deactivated," Dr. Ashworth announced. They waited 30 seconds, then opened the chamber to retrieve the clock. When Dr. Blackwood examined it, her face went pale. "The clock shows a time 37 seconds behind our reference clocks," she said quietly. 37 seconds. They had aimed for 30 seconds backward and had achieved 37 seconds of temporal displacement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that they had actually manipulated time itself. Over the following months, the experiments became more ambitious. They began testing with cameras, attempting to capture images from different temporal positions. The results were disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. Photographs taken inside the chamber during temporal displacement showed images that shouldn't have existed. In one experiment, a camera positioned to photograph the eastern wall of the chamber returned images of a desert landscape, as if the wall had become transparent to reveal the Nevada landscape outside. But the landscape in the photograph showed a highway that hadn't been built yet, construction equipment that wouldn't arrive at the site for another 6 months. "The camera isn't just seeing through space," Voss noted in his private journal. "It's seeing through time. The temporal field is creating windows into other moments." Another experiment produced photographs of the chamber itself, but empty, showing scuff marks and equipment placement that wouldn't occur for weeks. It was as if the camera was capturing potential futures, alternate presents where time had moved forward but the researchers hadn't yet entered the chamber. But the most disturbing photograph came from an experiment in July. Dr. Blackwood had positioned a camera to capture the chamber during what should have been a routine 30-second backward displacement. When they developed the film, the image showed the chamber occupied by figures in hazmat suits, handling equipment that none of the researchers recognized. "Those aren't our people," Dr. Ashworth whispered when they examined the photograph. "And that's not our equipment," Dr. Castellanos added. Voss studied the photograph with growing unease. The figures in the image were clearly working in the same chamber, but with technology that appeared decades more advanced than anything Project Kronos possessed. One of the figures appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if aware that they were being observed across time. "Who authorized this photograph to be taken?" Colonel Thornfield demanded when he was shown the image. "No one," Dr. Blackwood replied. "It was a routine temporal displacement test. The camera was supposed to capture the empty chamber 30 seconds in the past." Thornfield examined the photograph carefully, his expression unreadable. "This chamber, with these people and this equipment? That's impossible," Dr. Ashworth protested. "We're the only ones with access to this facility." "Are we?" Thornfield asked quietly. That night, Voss lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The implications of what they had photographed were staggering. If the image showed the future, It suggested that Project Kronos would continue operating for years or decades beyond their current timeline. But the technology in the photograph was clearly more advanced than anything they currently possessed, which raised uncomfortable questions about where those advances would come from. More disturbing was the possibility that the photograph showed an alternate present, a parallel timeline where different people had access to the chamber. If temporal manipulation could create windows into other realities, then everything they thought they understood about cause and effect was fundamentally flawed. The whispers began around this time, late-night conversations between researchers, rumours passed in hushed tones during shift changes. Some claimed that Project Kronos wasn't original research at all, but reverse engineering work based on technology recovered from outside sources. Roswell, Dr. Blackwood whispered to Voss one evening as they reviewed test data. They say we're working from blueprints recovered in 1947. That's ridiculous, Voss replied. But even as he said it, he remembered the photograph of the unknown figures. If their temporal experiments were based on technology from an external source, it would explain the rapid progress they had made and the disturbing glimpses of advanced equipment in their temporal photographs. Is it? Dr. Blackwood asked. Look at what we've accomplished in less than 2 years. We've gone from theoretical speculation to actual temporal displacement. That's not normal scientific progress. That's reverse engineering. Voss didn't have an answer for that. But as the months passed and their experiments became more sophisticated, he began to suspect that Dr. Blackwood was right. They weren't pioneering new science. They were rediscovering old science, science that someone or something else had mastered decades earlier. The transition from mechanical tests to biological subjects began in the fall of 1979. Voss had expected it, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Temporal displacement effects on living tissue, Colonel Thornfield announced during a team briefing. We need to understand how biological systems respond to temporal field exposure before we can consider human applications. The first subjects were laboratory mice, provided by the facility's medical research division. The experiments followed standard protocols, baseline health assessments, controlled temporal displacement exposure, post-exposure observation and analysis. The results were immediately concerning. Mice subjected to short temporal displacements, 5 to 10 seconds backward in time, showed signs of severe disorientation and stress. Their brain activity patterns were disrupted for hours after exposure, and many subjects died within 24 hours of testing. Temporal displacement appears to cause neurological trauma in mammalian subjects, Dr. Ashworth reported grimly. The brain's temporal processing centres can't handle the paradox of experiencing the same moments multiple times. But some mice survived, and the data from successful subjects was fascinating. Blood samples taken immediately after temporal displacement showed cellular activity that was hours out of sync with the subject's chronological age. It was as if parts of their bodies were operating on different temporal schedules. We're not just moving subjects through time, Voss observed. We're fragmenting their temporal experience. Different parts of their biology are experiencing time at different rates. The implications were staggering. If human subjects underwent temporal displacement, they might experience psychological effects that made the mouse studies look trivial. The human brain's complex temporal processing capabilities could be permanently damaged by even short exposures to temporal fields. Despite these concerning results, the pressure to move to human testing came from above. Colonel Thornfield received orders from his superiors, and in December 1979, the first unmarked military buses began arriving at the facility. They came at night, always at night. Voss would see them from his quarters window, dark vehicles with tinted glass rolling through the security checkpoint. He never saw the occupants board or disembark, but he knew what they were bringing to the facility. Volunteers, Colonel Thornfield explained when Voss confronted him about the buses. Military personnel who have volunteered for experimental duty. What kind of volunteers arrive in buses with blacked-out windows? Voss demanded. The kind whose identities are classified, Thornfield replied coldly. Dr. Voss, your job is the physics. Let us worry about personnel procurement. But Voss couldn't ignore what was happening. The new arrivals were housed in a separate section of the facility, one that none of the research staff were allowed to access. Meals were delivered by military personnel, not the civilian support staff who served the research areas, and the few glimpses Voss caught of the test subjects suggested they weren't typical military volunteers. "They're prisoners," Dr. Blackwood whispered to him one evening. "Death row inmates, military prisoners, people who won't be missed if something goes wrong." "You can't know that for certain," Voss replied, but he suspected she was right. The first human temporal displacement test occurred in January 1980. Voss wasn't allowed in the observation room, but he could monitor the experiment from his laboratory through the facility's internal communication system. "Subject designated H1 secured in chamber," came the announcement over the speakers. "Medical monitoring systems active. Temporal field generators at standby." Voss found himself holding his breath as he listened to the countdown. Somewhere below him, a human being was about to experience something that no person in history had ever survived. Initiating temporal field. Displacement achieved. Subject is 30 seconds backward from baseline temporal position. A pause that seemed to last forever. Temporal field deactivated. Subject is returning to baseline temporal position. Another pause. Medical alert. Subject is in cardiac arrest. Emergency medical team to chamber 1. Voss closed his eyes. The first human test subject had died, but the test continued. Subject H2 survived the displacement but suffered what appeared to be a complete psychotic break, babbling about seeing himself from the outside, experiencing his own death, living the same moments over and over again. Subject H3 emerged from the chamber, aged by what appeared to be several years, despite being displaced for only minutes. "The temporal field is interacting with human consciousness in ways we don't understand," Dr. Ashworth reported after reviewing the medical data. "The subjects aren't just moving through time, they're experiencing temporal fragmentation. Their minds are being split across multiple time streams. Subject H4 emerged from the chamber claiming to have memories that weren't his own, detailed knowledge of events that hadn't happened yet, conversations with people who weren't there. Medical scans showed no physical trauma, but psychological evaluation revealed a complete break from reality. He says he's been living the same day for weeks," the medical technician reported. "Claims that every time the test ends, he wakes up this morning and has to do it all over again." Subject H5 never emerged from the chamber at all. The temporal field activated normally. The displacement proceeded according to plan, but when they deactivated the field, the chamber was empty. No trace of the subject remained, no indication of where they had gone or what had happened to them. "Complete temporal displacement," Colonel Thornfield noted in his report. "Subject has achieved permanent temporal translation." That was the military's euphemism for what Voss knew was murder. They had sent someone into the time stream with no way to return, condemning them to an existence outside of normal reality. The test continued through the spring and summer of 1980. Most subjects died. Some suffered psychological trauma that left them catatonic, and a few simply vanished. But occasionally, very rarely, a subject would return apparently unharmed. Subject H23 emerged from a 5-minute displacement reporting that he had experienced the same 5 minutes repeatedly, like a film loop, but had retained awareness throughout the repetitions. Subject H31 claimed to have spent subjective hours in what had been a 10-second displacement, exploring a version of the facility that was simultaneously familiar and completely different. Temporal displacement may allow access to parallel timelines, Dr. Blackwood theorized. The subjects who survive may be those whose consciousness can adapt to experiencing multiple realities simultaneously. It was around this time that Voss began to suspect the true purpose of Project Kronos. The human experiments weren't scientific exploration. They were training exercises, preparing subjects for operational deployments. The government wasn't just trying to understand time travel, they were trying to weaponize it. His suspicions were confirmed when Colonel Thornfield began asking specific questions about temporal displacement accuracy. "Can we target specific dates and times?" Thornfield wanted to know. Could an operative be inserted into a particular historical moment? What would be the range limitations for operational deployment? Voss realized with growing horror that the government was planning to use time travel for intelligence and military operations. The failed test subjects weren't scientific casualties. They were prototype soldiers in a war that hadn't been declared yet. He began keeping detailed notes in a private journal, documenting everything he observed about the experiments and their true purpose. If Project Kronos was indeed developing temporal warfare capabilities, the world needed to know about it. But he also knew that speaking out would likely result in his own death, or worse, his own recruitment as an unwilling test subject. The moral weight of what they were doing became unbearable. Each night Voss lay in his bunk knowing that somewhere in the facility, prisoners were being subjected to temporal displacement experiments that would likely kill them or drive them insane. He was participating in something that violated every principle of scientific ethics, every concept of human decency. But he was also terrified of what would happen if he tried to leave. The non-disclosure agreements he had signed weren't just legal documents, they were death warrants for anyone who violated them. And the deeper he became involved in Project Kronos, the more he understood that the people running it would kill to protect their secrets. As 1980 drew to a close, Voss made a decision that would ultimately cost him everything. He would stay with Project Kronos, but he would document everything, gather evidence of what they were doing, and find a way to expose the program to the world. He had no idea that his own temporal displacement was only months away, or that he would soon discover the true scope of what the government was doing with their mastery of time. The night of January 15th, 1981 changed everything. Voss had been working late in the laboratory, running diagnostics on the temporal field generators after an afternoon test that had gone badly wrong. Subject H-47 had emerged from the chamber speaking fluent Russian, despite having entered as a monolingual English speaker. The medical team was baffled, the intelligence officers were excited, and Voss was disturbed by the implications. If temporal displacement could allow subjects to acquire knowledge they had never learned, it suggested that consciousness could somehow access information from alternate timelines or parallel realities. The philosophical implications were staggering, but the military applications were obvious. We could insert operatives with complete knowledge of foreign languages, local customs, specific historical details, Colonel Thornfield had mused during the post-test briefing. Imagine an agent who could be dropped into any historical period with perfect cultural knowledge. Voss had excused himself from the meeting, claiming he needed to run system diagnostics. In reality, he couldn't stomach listening to any more discussion of how to exploit their discoveries for intelligence operations. Now, alone in the laboratory at nearly midnight, he was attempting to understand what had happened to subject H-47. The temporal field data showed anomalies he'd never seen before, fluctuations that suggested the displacement had been much more complex than a simple backward movement through time. There are resonance patterns here, he muttered to himself, studying the readouts, as if the temporal field is interacting with something else. The chamber's magnetic field generators were powered down but still connected to the main reactor. Voss activated the diagnostic systems, intending to run a low-power test that would help him understand the field interactions without risking another full displacement. What he didn't know was that the afternoon's test had left residual temporal distortions in the chamber, invisible to conventional instruments but still active at a quantum level. When he activated the diagnostic systems, he inadvertently created a resonance effect that began amplifying these residual distortions. The first sign of trouble was the lights. They began to flicker, then dim, as if the facility's power grid was being drained by something enormous. Voss looked up from his instruments to see the chamber beginning to glow with an eerie blue light. "Shutdown protocol," he said aloud, reaching for the emergency controls. But the controls weren't responding. The chamber's systems had gone into some kind of automatic sequence, one that wasn't part of any programmed operation. The blue glow intensified, and Voss could feel the air beginning to vibrate with barely contained energy. He tried the manual shutdown switches, but they were locked out by whatever process had taken control of the chamber. The blue light was becoming painful to look at, and the vibration in the air was making his teeth ache. "Computer emergency shutdown authorization Voss 77 Alpha," he called out to the facility's central control system. "Emergency shutdown not authorized," came the computerized reply. "Temporal displacement sequence in progress." Temporal displacement sequence. But there was no test scheduled, no subject in the chamber, no authorized personnel in the control room. The chamber was operating on its own, following some program that Voss didn't recognize. The blue light suddenly intensified to a blinding level, and Voss felt a pulling sensation, as if the chamber was drawing him toward it. He tried to move away, but his body wasn't responding to his commands. The temporal field was affecting his nervous system, overriding his voluntary muscle control. "Help!" he shouted, knowing that there was no one else in the laboratory level at this hour. The pulling sensation became irresistible. Voss found himself walking toward the chamber despite every instinct telling him to run in the opposite direction. The blue light enveloped him, and suddenly the familiar laboratory around him began to dissolve. Reality twisted. The walls stretched and warped. The ceiling became a kaleidoscope of impossible angles, and the floor beneath his feet felt like water. Voss tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his mouth. He was falling through time itself, tumbling through a void that existed between moments. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation ended. Voss found himself standing on a street corner, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of a city. But something was wrong. The cars were old-fashioned. The clothing styles were decades out of date, and the buildings around him looked different than he remembered. A newspaper vendor was hawking papers from a nearby stand. Voss approached him with growing dread. "What's the date?" he asked. "November 21st, 1963, the vendor replied. "You okay, mister? You look like you've seen a ghost." November 21st, 1963, the day before President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. Voss was in Washington, D.C., but he was 28 years in the past. Panic set in first, then fascination. He was actually experiencing time travel, not as a researcher observing test subjects, but as the subject himself. He was living proof that temporal displacement was possible, that human consciousness could survive the transition between timelines. But as he walked through the streets of 1963 Washington, Voss began to notice details that disturbed him. Men in dark suits who seemed to be watching him, following him at a discreet distance. Equipment being loaded into unmarked vans. Equipment that looked eerily familiar. He ducked into a coffee shop and pretended to read a menu while watching the street through the window. The men in suits had positioned themselves at strategic locations around the block, clearly maintaining surveillance on his location. But how could they know he was here? How could anyone in 1963 be prepared for his arrival? Temporal displacement operatives, he realized with growing horror. Project Kronos has been sending people back for years. The implications hit him like a physical blow. If the government had mastered temporal displacement well enough to deploy operatives in the past, then everything he thought he knew about history might be wrong. Major events, political decisions, social changes, all of them could have been influenced by time travelers acting on behalf of future interests. He needed to get closer to the operatives, to see what they were doing, to understand the scope of the temporal intervention program. Carefully he made his way out of the coffee shop and began following one of the surveillance teams. They led him to a government building that he didn't recognize, but which was clearly some kind of federal facility. Men were loading briefcases and electronic equipment into vehicles, preparing for what looked like a major operation. And the equipment, Voss realized with shock, was identical to the temporal monitoring devices used at Project Kronos. "They're not just observing," he whispered to himself, "they're actively intervening." As he watched, hidden behind a parked car, Voss saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the operatives turned in his direction, and for a moment their eyes met across the street. The man's face was familiar, terrifyingly familiar. It was Colonel Thornfield, but a version of Thornfield who was 28 years younger. Thornfield as he would have appeared in 1963, working for whatever predecessor organisation had given birth to Project Kronos. The young Thornfield spoke into a radio, and immediately the other operatives began moving in Voss's direction. They had identified him as a temporal displacement subject, and they were moving to intercept him. Voss ran through the streets of 1963 Washington, pursued by government agents who shouldn't have existed yet, carrying technology that wouldn't be invented for decades. Everything he thought he understood about causality, about the linear nature of time, was crumbling around him. He found temporary shelter in the Smithsonian Museum, losing himself among the exhibits and tourist crowds. But even there, he couldn't escape the implications of what he had discovered. If Project Kronos operatives were active in 1963, they had likely been active throughout history. The program wasn't just developing time travel capabilities, it was using them to reshape the past according to some predetermined agenda. As evening approached, Voss felt the familiar pulling sensation that indicated his temporal displacement was ending. Reality began to dissolve around him once again, and he found himself falling through the void between moments, returning to his own time. He materialized in the Project Kronos laboratory exactly 72 hours after he had left, though he had subjectively experienced only about 6 hours in 1963. The chamber was dark and silent. The diagnostic systems automatically shut down. To anyone reviewing the logs, it would appear that he had simply worked late and then gone to his quarters. But Voss knew that everything had changed. He had seen the truth about Project Kronos, about the government's use of time travel for historical intervention, and he knew that he was now a liability to the program, someone who had learned too much about their real agenda. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The confrontation came 3 days later. Voss had spent the intervening time reviewing historical records, looking for evidence of temporal intervention in major world events. What he found terrified him. Unexplained technological advances during World War II, political assassinations that had altered the course of history, economic crises that had benefited American interests in ways that seemed too convenient to be coincidental, social movements that had emerged and disappeared with suspicious timing. All of it could be explained by the presence of time travellers working to ensure specific historical outcomes. Colonel Thornfield summoned him to a secure briefing room on sub-level 5, deeper underground than Voss had ever been. The room was sterile and windowless, designed for conversations that could never be allowed to leak to the outside world. "Dr. Voss," Thornfield began without preamble, "we need to discuss your unauthorized temporal displacement event." Voss's blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow they had detected his accidental trip to 1963. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The chamber's quantum resonance detectors recorded a significant temporal disturbance 3 nights ago," Thornfield continued. "The energy signature was consistent with human temporal displacement. Since all authorized personnel were accounted for, we have to assume that someone experienced an accidental displacement event." Voss remained silent, calculating his options. If they knew about his displacement but weren't certain he was responsible, he might be able to maintain plausible deniability. "However," Thornfield continued, "we also have reports from our 1963 surveillance team of an unidentified temporal operative who appeared to be conducting reconnaissance on their operation." The bottom dropped out of Voss's stomach. They had been watching him in 1963, documenting his presence, probably photographing him for identification purposes. "Dr. Voss, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you experience temporal displacement to November 21st, 1963? There was no point in lying now. They had evidence, probably photographic proof of his presence in the past. Denial would only make things worse. "Yes," he said simply. Thornfield nodded as if he had expected the admission. "What did you observe during your displacement?" "I saw government operatives in 1963 carrying Project Kronos equipment," Voss replied. "I saw you, Colonel, or a younger version of you, coordinating what appeared to be a major intelligence operation. And what conclusions did you draw from these observations?" Voss took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the point where he would either be recruited deeper into the program or eliminated as a security risk. "I concluded that Project Kronos isn't a research program," he said. "It's an operational program. You've been using time travel to intervene in historical events, to ensure that history unfolds according to a predetermined plan." Thornfield leaned back in his chair, studying Voss with an expression that revealed nothing. "That's a very serious accusation, Dr. Voss." "It's not an accusation. It's an observation based on evidence. Evidence that you obtained through unauthorized temporal displacement. Evidence that exists regardless of how I obtained it." Thornfield was quiet for a long moment. then reached into a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with security classifications that Voss had never seen before. Dr. Voss, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that exist above the President's security clearance. The information in this folder could destabilize governments, crash economies, and fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its own history. He opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed President Kennedy in Dallas, but taken from an angle that no civilian photographer could have achieved. In the background, barely visible, was a figure in modern clothing holding what appeared to be advanced surveillance equipment. November 22nd, 1963, Thornfield said quietly. One of our operatives documenting the assassination from a temporal vantage point. Voss stared at the photograph in horror. You were there. You were actually there during the Kennedy assassination. We've been there for every major historical event for the past 40 years, Thornfield replied. The assassination of Lincoln, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Every turning point in modern history has been observed, documented, and when necessary, influenced by Project Kronos operatives. Another photograph, soldiers storming a beach that looked like Normandy, but with equipment that didn't exist in 1944. Men in period-appropriate clothing carrying weapons that wouldn't be invented for decades. D-Day, Thornfield explained. We had 17 operatives embedded with the Allied forces, carrying advanced communications equipment and tactical intelligence that ensured the invasion's success. You changed the outcome of World War II. We ensured the outcome of World War II. There were timeline branches where the Nazis developed nuclear weapons first, where the invasion failed, where the war lasted another decade. Our interventions prevented those outcomes. Photograph after photograph, temporal operatives at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, at the Gettysburg Address, at the moon landing. American history as Voss understood it was a carefully orchestrated performance, directed by time travelers working to ensure specific outcomes. The mission of Project Kronos, Thornfield continued, is to maintain temporal stability in favour of American interests. We identify historical inflection points where events could unfold in ways that would be detrimental to the United States or to global stability. Then we deploy operatives to ensure that history proceeds according to optimal parameters. Optimal according to who? According to computer models that analyse millions of potential timeline branches, we've developed quantum computers that can simulate historical outcomes decades into the future. They identify the timeline paths that result in the greatest benefit for humanity as a whole. Voss felt sick. And who decided that you had the right to make those choices? Who gave you the authority to determine the course of human history? No one gave us the authority, Thornfield replied. We took it, because someone has to. Do you know what happens in the timeline branches where we don't intervene? Nuclear war in 1962, global economic collapse in 1929 that lasts for decades. The Holocaust expanded to include entire populations of Africa and Asia. World War III beginning in 1975 and ending with the extinction of human civilization. Those are just projections. Those are mathematical certainties based on chaos theory and quantum probability analysis. Every major decision point in history creates branching pathways, and most of those pathways lead to catastrophic outcomes. Our interventions prune the timeline tree, eliminating the branches that lead to human extinction. Thornfield slid another document across the table. It was a timeline chart showing major historical events, but with notations indicating Project Kronos intervention points. The American Revolution. We provided intelligence that prevented British forces from capturing George Washington at Valley Forge. The Civil War. We ensured that Lincoln's assassination occurred after the war's conclusion rather than during it. World War I. We prevented the development of mustard gas weapons that would have killed millions more. World War II. We guided Allied strategy and prevented Nazi scientific breakthroughs. The Kennedy assassination? A necessary intervention. In the original timeline, Kennedy lived to serve 2 full terms. His policies led to nuclear war with the Soviet Union in 1967. His death, while tragic, prevented the extinction of human civilization. Voss stared at the documents in disbelief. You're talking about murdering presidents to prevent theoretical future disasters. We're talking about making hard choices to preserve the human species, Thornfield corrected. Every intervention is carefully calculated to minimise immediate harm while preventing catastrophic future outcomes. And the test subjects? The prisoners you've been killing in temporal displacement experiments? Training exercises. We need operatives who can survive temporal displacement and function effectively in past time periods. The volunteer program provides us with subjects for developing displacement protocols and training procedures. Volunteers, Voss said bitterly. Men who are going to die anyway. Death row inmates, military prisoners facing execution for treason, enemy agents captured during intelligence operations. We offer them a choice: certain death or participation in experiments that might save their lives and serve their country. How many of them survive the training? Approximately 3%. Voss felt bile rise in his throat. 97% mortality rate, and Thornfield was describing it as if it were an acceptable cost of doing business. Dr. Voss, Thornfield continued, you now know the truth about Project Kronos. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? I don't have a choice, do I? You have two choices. The first is to continue your work with the project, but with full knowledge of our operational mission. Your expertise in temporal field physics would be invaluable for improving our displacement accuracy and reducing operative mortality rates. And the second choice? Thornfield didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid one more photograph across the table. It showed Voss himself, standing in his laboratory, but the timestamp indicated it was taken 3 days in the future. That photograph was taken by one of our operatives during a routine temporal reconnaissance mission, Thornfield explained. It shows you exactly 72 hours from now, working alone in your laboratory on unauthorized modifications to the temporal displacement chamber. Voss examined the photograph with growing dread. He could see himself clearly, working with equipment that he didn't recognize, making modifications to the chamber that would clearly be unauthorized. In approximately 72 hours, Dr. Voss, you will attempt to use the displacement chamber to travel back in time and prevent the formation of Project Kronos. Your plan will be to appear at key moments in the program's development and sabotage the research that led to successful temporal displacement. How can you know that? Because we've observed it. Our operatives have been present at every point in history where you attempt to intervene. We've documented your efforts to prevent the Manhattan Project, to sabotage the recruitment of Dr. Zimmerman, to warn government officials about the dangers of temporal manipulation. Thornfield produced a series of photographs showing Voss at various points in history, always being observed by Project Kronos operatives, always being prevented from completing his missions. Every timeline branch where you attempt to stop Project Kronos leads to catastrophic outcomes for human civilization. Without our interventions, World War III begins in 1976. Nuclear weapons are used in regional conflicts throughout the 1980s. Global environmental collapse occurs in the 1990s. Human civilization effectively ends by the year 2000. So you're saying I have no choice? You have free will, Dr. Voss. You can choose to attempt your sabotage mission, but you should understand that we will be waiting for you at every historical intervention point. Your mission will fail, and your actions will result in your permanent displacement to a timeline where you can no longer affect historical outcomes. Permanent displacement. Exile to a temporal position where you can observe history but not interact with it. A living death, conscious but unable to affect the world around you. Voss stared at the photographs of his future self, evidence of a predetermined destiny that he was powerless to avoid. Project Kronos had turned temporal manipulation into the ultimate form of control, ensuring that even rebellion against their program was futile. What guarantee do I have that Project Kronos is actually preventing disasters rather than causing them? None, Thornfield admitted. You'll have to trust that our quantum probability models are accurate, and that our interventions are motivated by genuine concern for human welfare rather than purely American political interests. And if I refuse to trust you, then you'll spend the next 72 hours preparing for a mission that you already know will fail, and will spend the same time preparing countermeasures that we already know will succeed. Voss realized that he was trapped in a temporal paradox. His knowledge of Project Kronos' true mission compelled him to try to stop them, but their knowledge of his future actions ensured that his attempts would fail. They had created a closed loop in time, where rebellion was inevitable but ineffective. "There is a third option," Thornfield said quietly, "which is, help us improve the system. Your expertise could reduce operative mortality rates, improve displacement accuracy, and develop more humane training protocols. You can't stop Project Kronos, but you can help make it more ethical." Voss looked at the photographs again, evidence of his own future failure staring back at him. He was caught in a web of predestination, where his choices had already been observed and countered by forces that operated outside normal temporal causality. "I need time to think," he said finally. "You have 72 hours, Thornfield replied. "The same 72 hours you've always had." Voss returned to his quarters with the knowledge that his every action for the next 3 days had already been observed and documented by Project Kronos operatives. It was a level of predestination that made free will seem like an illusion, but it also presented him with a unique opportunity. If his future rebellion was already known and countered, then perhaps he could find a way to rebel differently, to act in ways that hadn't been predicted or observed. He began by carefully examining the photographs that Thornfield had shown him. The images of his future self working in the laboratory showed specific equipment modifications, particular approaches to sabotaging the temporal displacement chamber. If he could identify exactly what his future self was planning, he might be able to develop an alternative approach that would avoid the predicted countermeasures. The photographs revealed that his future self was working to modify the chamber's targeting systems, apparently attempting to create a temporal displacement that would send him to specific historical moments where he could interfere with Project Kronos' development. But the modifications were crude, clearly the work of someone operating under extreme time pressure and without access to proper resources. "They expect me to work alone," Voss realised. "They expect me to attempt this sabotage as a solo operation." But what if he didn't work alone? What if he could recruit other members of the research team, people who shared his moral concerns about the project's true mission? Dr. Blackwood had expressed doubts about the ethical implications of their work. Dr. Ashworth had seemed disturbed by the human test subject program. Dr. Castellanos had questioned the military applications of their research. If Voss could convince them that Project Kronos was operating far beyond its stated mission, they might be willing to help him develop a more sophisticated approach to stopping the program. The challenge was communicating with them without triggering the surveillance systems that monitored all conversations within the facility. Project Kronos had undoubtedly documented not just his actions but his communications, which meant that any direct approach to his colleagues would be anticipated and countered. But the facility's surveillance systems were designed to monitor present-time activities. They relied on conventional audio and video recording, not temporal observation. If Voss could find a way to communicate with his colleagues using methods that wouldn't be recorded by present-time surveillance, he might be able to avoid detection. He began by leaving coded messages in places where his colleagues would find them during their normal work routines. Mathematical equations written on laboratory whiteboards that contained hidden meanings. Technical documents with specific passages highlighted that spelled out warnings when read in sequence. References to scientific papers that didn't exist, but whose titles conveyed important information. The first to respond was Dr. Blackwood. She approached him during a shift change, pretending to discuss routine calibration procedures, while actually acknowledging that she had received his coded messages. "The temporal resonance calculations you left on the board yesterday," she said casually. "I've been reviewing them, and I think there might be some fundamental errors in the baseline assumptions." "Oh," Voss replied, understanding that she was playing along with the coded communication. "The equations assume that temporal displacement is a neutral process, but what if it's not? What if the act of displacement itself creates ethical obligations that we haven't considered?" Dr. Ashworth joined the conversation the next day, ostensibly discussing power consumption calculations, but actually indicating that she too had concerns about the project's direction. "I've been looking at the energy expenditure reports," she said. "The amount of power we're using suggests that our experiments are far more extensive than what we've been told. Either we're conducting many more tests than I'm aware of, or we're conducting much more complex operations." Dr. Castellanos was the most direct in his response. During a routine equipment maintenance session, he quietly confirmed that he knew about the project's operational mission. "I've seen the transport schedules," he whispered while pretending to adjust a magnetic field calibrator. "Buses arriving and departing on a regular schedule, but the passenger manifests are classified above our security level. We're not just conducting research here, we're training people for field operations." Over the course of 2 days, Voss carefully assembled a conspiracy within Project Kronos, a group of researchers who understood that their work was being used for purposes far beyond scientific exploration. But he also knew that time was running out. According to Thornfield's photographs, he would begin his sabotage attempt within 24 hours. The plan they developed was more sophisticated than anything his future self had attempted in the documented timeline. Instead of crude modifications to the displacement chamber, they would introduce subtle changes to the facility's quantum computers, alterations that would gradually corrupt the probability models that guided Project Kronos' historical interventions. "If we can introduce errors into their timeline calculations," Dr. Blackwood explained, "their operatives will be deployed to the wrong historical moments. Their interventions will fail, and the timeline branches they're trying to prevent will occur naturally." "It's not sabotage," Dr. Ashworth added, it's restoration. We're restoring natural historical causality by removing artificial interventions." But even as they planned their sophisticated rebellion, Voss suspected that their efforts were ultimately futile. Project Kronos operated with knowledge of future events, which meant they likely knew about this conspiracy as well. Their sophisticated approach might be more elegant than his future self's crude sabotage attempt, but it would probably be just as ineffective. Still, he had to try. The moral weight of what Project Kronos was doing, the violation of human free will on a historical scale, demanded resistance, even if that resistance was doomed to failure. The night before his predicted sabotage attempt, Voss lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling and contemplating the nature of predestination. If his actions were already known and countered, did he really have free will? Or was he simply playing out a predetermined role in a cosmic drama written by forces beyond his understanding? The answer came to him in the early hours of the morning. Free will wasn't about the outcome of his actions, it was about the choice to act according to his conscience, regardless of consequences. Even if his rebellion failed, even if he was exiled to temporal isolation, he would have chosen to resist rather than collaborate with a system that violated every principle he believed in. At 0300 hours, exactly as predicted in Thornfield's photographs, Voss made his way to the laboratory to begin the sabotage operation that would define the rest of his existence. The laboratory was empty and eerily quiet as Voss entered at exactly 0347 hours. The timestamp on Thornfield's photographs had been precise to the minute, which meant that Project Kronos operatives were probably already positioned throughout history, waiting for his inevitable arrival at whatever historical intervention points he chose. But Voss had one advantage that his observers didn't expect. He wasn't planning to travel to the past to sabotage Project Kronos' development. Instead, he was planning to travel to the future, to a time when the consequences of the program's interventions would be clear. If Project Kronos was genuinely preventing catastrophic outcomes, then the future should show a stable, prosperous human civilization. But if their interventions were actually causing more harm than good, the future would reveal the true cost of their temporal manipulations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of attempting to change the past, which Project Kronos had already demonstrated was futile, he would gather evidence from the future and bring it back to expose the program's true consequences. He began by making the modifications shown in Thornfield's photographs, knowing that the surveillance systems would need to record these actions to maintain consistency with the predicted timeline. But while his hands performed the expected sabotage preparations, his mind was calculating the real modifications he would make once the cameras stopped recording. The temporal displacement chamber's targeting system was sophisticated enough to allow travel to specific dates and locations, but it had never been used for forward temporal displacement. The mathematics were theoretically sound, but the practical applications were unknown. Forward displacement to December 31st, 2099, he programmed into the targeting computer. Duration: 12 hours subjective time. If humanity survived the next century with Project Kronos' interventions, he would find a thriving civilization. If the program's manipulations led to disaster, he would find evidence of that disaster. Either way, he would return with proof of the program's true consequences. But as he prepared to enter the displacement chamber, Voss heard footsteps in the corridor outside the laboratory. Someone was coming, probably security personnel sent to intercept him at the predicted moment of his sabotage attempt. He had only seconds before they arrived. Stepping into the chamber, he activated the displacement sequence and prayed that his calculations were correct. The familiar blue light enveloped him. Reality dissolved around him, and he felt the sensation of falling through time. But this time, instead of falling backward into the past, he was falling forward into the unknown future. The journey seemed to last forever. Voss tumbled through a void filled with swirling lights and impossible geometries, conscious but disconnected from physical reality. He caught glimpses of potential futures flashing past him like frames from a broken film. Cities in flames, technological marvels, environmental devastation, space colonies, nuclear wastelands, utopian societies. Then suddenly he was standing on solid ground again. But the world around him was not what he had expected. He was in what appeared to be a museum, surrounded by exhibits displaying artifacts from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But the artifacts were wrong, subtly different from the world he remembered. Newspaper headlines that didn't match his memories of historical events, photographs of political leaders he didn't recognize, technologies that should have existed but apparently never had. Temporal displacement subject detected, announced a computerized voice. Initiating containment protocols. Before Voss could react, he was surrounded by figures in environmental suits carrying advanced-looking weapons. They moved with military precision, clearly trained for exactly this type of encounter. Dr. Nathaniel Voss, one of them said through their suit's communication system. Temporal signature consistent with 1981 displacement origin. You're exactly where and when our models predicted you would be. Who are you? Voss demanded. Temporal Security Division, the figure replied. We monitor and contain unauthorized temporal displacement events. You've been expected for 118 years. They escorted him through the museum to what appeared to be a debriefing chamber. The walls were lined with monitors displaying information that made Voss's blood run cold. Timeline progression charts showing humanity's development from 1981 to 2099. Historical events that had been adjusted by Project Kronos operatives. Probability calculations showing the outcomes that had been prevented and the outcomes that had been ensured. The world you come from no longer exists, the lead security officer explained. Project Kronos' interventions created a branching timeline that diverged from natural history in 1963. What you're seeing now is the result of 136 years of controlled historical development. And what happened to natural history? Global nuclear war in 1967, environmental collapse in the 1980s, human extinction by 2001. The monitors showed images of the alternate timeline, the world that would have existed without Project Kronos' interventions. It was exactly as Thornfield had predicted. Devastation, warfare, and ultimately the complete extinction of human civilization. So they were right, Voss said quietly. Project Kronos actually was preventing catastrophe. In the short term, the security officer agreed, but their interventions created new problems that required additional interventions. By 2050, temporal operatives were conducting thousands of historical adjustments every year. The timeline became so heavily manipulated that natural causality effectively ceased to exist. More monitors activated, showing the true scope of Project Kronos' activities in the decades following Voss's displacement. Historical events that had been carefully orchestrated, political movements that had been artificially created or suppressed, technological developments that had been guided or prevented. Humanity survived, the security officer continued, but human free will did not. Every major decision, every significant event, every important choice has been predetermined by temporal intervention algorithms. People in your original timeline lived their lives believing they had freedom, never knowing that their choices were the result of careful historical manipulation. And now we live in a managed timeline. Human suffering has been minimized, global catastrophes have been prevented, and technological development has been optimized for maximum benefit. But individual human choice has been effectively eliminated. Voss stared at the displays in horror. Project Kronos had succeeded in preventing human extinction, but only by destroying human freedom. They'd created a world where every aspect of history was artificially controlled, where spontaneous human development was impossible. "We brought you here to make a choice, Dr. Voss," the security officer said. "You can return to your original timeline with this knowledge, knowing that your attempts to expose Project Kronos will fail, or you can remain here, in a future where humanity has survived but sacrificed its essential nature." What about a third option? There is no third option. The timeline branches we've examined all lead to either human extinction or human subjugation. Project Kronos represents the least harmful path forward. Voss realized that he was facing the ultimate moral paradox. Project Kronos was simultaneously humanity's salvation and humanity's destruction. Their interventions prevented physical extinction while ensuring spiritual death. "I want to return," he said finally. "Even knowing that my efforts will fail, I want to return to a timeline where human choice still matters. That choice will doom the human species to extinction, but it will preserve the human spirit." The security officer nodded as if he had expected this response. "Your choice is consistent with our behavioral models. Dr. Voss, you will be returned to your original timeline, but your knowledge of future events will be suppressed until the moment of your final temporal displacement. You will remember only that Project Kronos must be stopped, not why it must be stopped. And my final displacement will occur when you attempt to expose the program. You'll be permanently displaced to a temporal position where you can observe but not interact with history. It is the only way to prevent you from creating paradoxes that could unravel the managed timeline." As the security officers prepared him for return displacement, Voss understood that he was trapped in a temporal cage. His moral convictions compelled him to resist Project Kronos, but his resistance was itself part of the managed timeline, a predetermined element in the system he was trying to destroy. The blue light enveloped him once again, and he fell backward through time toward his inevitable destiny. The official record states that Dr. Nathaniel Voss died in a temporal displacement accident on September the 15th, 1987. The classified reports describe a containment failure that resulted in his complete molecular disintegration. But those who worked closely with the project tell a different story. They say that in the final moments before the chamber imploded, Voss looked directly at the observation window and smiled. Not the expression of a man facing death, but the expression of someone who finally understood the nature of the game he was playing. The chamber's recording systems captured the final 30 seconds of the displacement sequence. In those 30 seconds, Voss can be seen standing calmly in the centre of the temporal field, speaking words that no audio system could record. "I understand now," he appears to say. "Free will isn't about changing the outcome. It's about choosing to resist even when resistance is futile." Then the field collapsed, reality folded in on itself, and Dr. Nathaniel Voss vanished from the normal flow of time. But the story doesn't end there. Every few years, photographs surface that suggest Voss didn't die in that chamber. Images of a man matching his description, appearing at significant historical moments. Standing in the crowd during Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, visible in the background during the fall of the Berlin Wall, present at the scene of the Challenger disaster. The conspiracy community calls him the Ghost Engineer, a temporal operative who exists outside the normal flow of time, appearing at moments when history hangs in the balance. Some believe he's still trying to expose Project Kronos, gathering evidence of their interventions that he can somehow use to alert the world to the truth. Others think he's become part of the system he tried to destroy, a temporal observer who documents the managed timeline without being able to change it. A living reminder of the price humanity paid for survival. The photographs are always blurry, always inconclusive, but they're consistent enough to suggest that someone matching Voss's description has been present at dozens of historically significant events over the past several decades. Project Kronos officially denies his continued existence. They claim the photographs are either coincidences or hoaxes, products of a conspiracy theory that has grown beyond any rational basis. But former operatives tell a different story. They say that Voss exists in a state of temporal flux, neither fully present in any given moment nor completely absent from history. He can observe but not interact, witness but not intervene. He has become a ghost in the machine of time itself, trapped between moments in existence that is neither life nor death. And sometimes, they say, if you know how to look for the signs, you can see evidence of his presence. A figure in the background of historical photographs that shouldn't be there. Shadows that move independently of their sources. Reflections in windows that show someone who isn't really there. The ghost engineer, they say, is still out there, somewhere in the spaces between seconds, still trying to find a way to free humanity from the temporal cage that was built to save it. Whether that's true or not, the legend of Dr. Nathaniel Voss serves as a reminder of the fundamental questions raised by Project Kronos. If you could prevent human extinction by eliminating human freedom, would you do it? If you could save the species by destroying the spirit, would that salvation be worth the cost? And perhaps most importantly, if you knew that your resistance was futile, that your choices had already been predicted and countered, would you still choose to resist? These are the questions that keep conspiracy theorists awake at night, spinning theories about government time travel programs and the men who tried to stop them. These are the questions that make people scan historical photographs looking for figures that shouldn't be there, searching for proof that somewhere, somewhen, someone is still fighting for human freedom. The official story is that Project Kronos never existed, that time travel is impossible, that the government has no ability to manipulate historical events. But late at night, when the rational mind sleeps and imagination takes over, people wonder if maybe, just maybe, the ghost engineer is still out there, still watching, still documenting, still hoping to find a way to set humanity free from the temporal chains that were forged to save it from itself. And if you look closely at the next historical photograph you see, if you examine the faces in the crowd and the figures in the shadows, you might just catch a glimpse of him yourself. A man out of time, a scientist who knew too much, a ghost in the machine of history itself. The question is, if you saw him, would you recognize him? And if you recognized him, would you understand what his presence really means? Sweet dreams, and thank you for listening to Sleep Theories. The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight, when the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible. That's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titor, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. Now, I've read a lot of these over the years, Bell continued, but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you. The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titor person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the Many Worlds Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid. The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titor mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target. Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us. The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. Well, that's quite a fax, Bell said when he finished. John Titor from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours. But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the tighter facts that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night, never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia, hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption. Not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titor Incident, Division SP Delta. Titor. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM 072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the tighter facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the coast-to-coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Veil appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titor incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titor who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous, a genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titer incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titer's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, the carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titor really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original Coast to Coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titer's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications, this doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report." Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titer incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titer incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titor's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Titer incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Titor incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Titor's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome, linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Titor incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titor began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titor, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time-travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titor into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lenara Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titer wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage, level B3, tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lenara Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titer project. According to the documents, she had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lena Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titer incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. "Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies. That someone is you, and now they know about me too." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" "The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years. The people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history. The people who made sure that John Titer became a joke instead of a warning." She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. "John Titer was real," she continued. "He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titer was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement." "But the timeline," Silas said. "If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things?" "That's the thing," Voss replied. "The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework." "So they killed him?" "They tried to, but Titer was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH-EUS files. That's why you're here now, talking to me." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titer? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. Events that don't quite line up with the historical record. People who remember things differently than they're supposed to. Temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. "This is what the timeline looks like now," she said. "Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself. And you think this is connected to the Titor incident? I think John Titor didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse." She handed him the device. "Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late." "What can we do?" "We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titor, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history." As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. "They found us," Voss whispered. "Run!" The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titor incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Kronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titor incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titor facts had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, they would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titor persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titor began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titor as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Kronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Ouroboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel. They were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titor. According to the Ouroboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titor wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titor, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titor was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titor incident. He was the Titor incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titor who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titor was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same, the warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past, and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titor files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Ouroboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.